Story 1. I think I almost got kidnapped as a kid. I, 24F, have a crazy long-term memory. I can clearly remember stuff from when I was 2 years old and remember things down to specific details like names, dates, colors, etc. People have always said that I'm making this up and that no one could possibly remember that far back, but I'm not. I truly have these memories. I have one specific memory that always makes me feel a bit uneasy. I remember one day when I was around 3 or 4 years old. My mom took me out to run errands with her. I believe the first store we went to that day was Target. When we left the store and walked into the parking lot, I somehow got separated from my mom, but I didn't realize it for some reason. I'm still confused as to why my mom didn't notice my absence either, but it's very possible she got distracted and looked away for a minute. I remember being kind of lost in my thoughts and getting into an open car that I thought was my mom's, but it turned out that it wasn't. I remember turning around and looking behind me once I started to actually crawl into the vehicle, because I was confused as to why my car seat wasn't in its usual place in the back seat. Behind me was a lady who I specifically remember standing there holding the right rear car door open and encouraging me to get in her back seat. The open door is why I got in the first place. I think my little brain didn't fully process what was going on in that moment, and I kind of went into a trance and started to comply. The next thing I remember is my mom calling my name, and I guess I kind of snapped back into reality and realized that I was not in a safe or familiar place. I remember scooting back out of the lady's car and running over to my mom, who was loading stuff from her cart into the trunk of her car that was parked about 50 feet to the left of the strange lady's car. The strange lady did not try to stop me when I ran, probably because my mom was looking right at me. I've thought about that moment so many times over the last many years. Did I almost get kidnapped? Why on earth would I even consider getting into a stranger's car when stranger danger was a frequently talked about topic in our house at that time? Did the lady think I was lost and try to help me, but I didn't understand because I was a little kid? I really doubt that option because I was always an ultra-observant old soul, even as a young kid, and I usually had some idea of what was happening around me. This memory has bugged me for so long. Thoughts. Story 2. Silent Clown. Sun breaks on a Monday morning where Jennifer was coming back from a night out. She doesn't remember much of the night, but what she feels in pain with her clothes ripped and bruises on her arm with a black eye that top it off. Something terrible happened to her and she can't remember what happened. Thoughts ran through her mind and she came back with one answer: she was drugged. All she knew that she has to get to her apartment before Mrs. Jackson walks her dog, Mr. Ryan leaves for work, and her neighbor's kid Paul leaves for school. Jennifer gets to our apartment building, enters through the front door, bypassing Mrs. Jackson's apartment, and headed straight towards the elevator. She pushes the button to her floor to get off at. As doors open, Jennifer rushes down to her apartment. As Jennifer got to her door, she opened her purse to look for her keys. She heard a door creaking open and slam in behind her. With the force of the slam made her jump, and dropping her keys on the floor, she heard a voice from behind her. It was a neighbor's kid, Paul. Paul was a freshman in high school. He leaves around 6:15 in the morning and I get to school by 7:20. Morning Jennifer, late night. Jennifer slowly turns to him, making sure he doesn't see her bruises and black eye, to face him, and chuckles a little and replies, "Haha, yes, I'm just getting in, so I'm off to bed. Have a good day at school." Paul chuckles back with her mark of having a good day at school. "Haha, funny, good night, then see you after at the school." Paul turns and heads towards the elevator to leave the building to go to school. As Jennifer watches Paul walking away to the elevator, she turns back to open her door and gets jump scared by a clown. The clown was Mr. Rogers, who happened to her neighbor that lives next door to Jennifer. Mr. Rogers couldn't speak because he was a mute. Jennifer doesn't know all that much about Mr. Rogers. Well, she knew he moved in a week ago and he works as a clown to make people laugh and smile, which makes Mr. Rogers the perfect person to talk to about problems, and she loves how to make her laugh to forget about her problems. Mr. Rogers looks Jennifer up and down. Jennifer feels shame at how she appears to him. Mr. Rogers grabs Jennifer's right arm and places his other hand on her bruised face. Jennifer looks at Mr. Rogers in the even though he can't speak. His painted face showed all of his emotions. Jennifer starts to cry. Mr. Rogers grabs Jennifer and gives her a hug, telling Jennifer everything is going to be all right. Mr. Rogers wiped the tears off of Jennifer's face, and then Mr. Rogers grabbed her keys to let her inside her apartment, so no one else can see her breaking down in the hallway. Mr. Rogers sat Jennifer down on her couch, then went to the kitchen to make her some tea to calm her down. Mr. Rogers stayed with Jennifer until she fell asleep. He locked her door. As he was walking down the hallway to the elevator, he thought to himself, I know who did this. Later that night, Mr. Rogers was coming home from work. Walk off the elevator heading to his apartment. He heard someone screaming down the hall. Mr. Rogers stopped dead in his tracks because the screaming voice sounded familiar. Mr. Rogers stared down the hall. He saw Jennifer's boyfriend pounding on the door, screaming and demanding her to open. Mr. Rogers stood in the shadows at the end of the hallway watching the violent scene of man versus door. As he continues to pound on the door, Mr. Rogers looks on with a hateful look. Jennifer's boyfriend pounded on the door till he felt like he was being watched. He turned his head to look down the hall, but there was no one there. He stopped and faced towards where the elevator was located to see if someone was lurking in the shadows of the dark hallway. With the feeling of being watched, he punches the door one last time, ends up screaming, I'll be back tomorrow, bitch. He walks into the darkness towards the elevator. He hits the button before he enters. He turns around and takes one last look to see if anyone's there. He saw no one. Walks on talking to himself. This place is freaking creepy. As the elevator doors were closing, Mr. Rogers was at the other end of the hall watching him leave with a hateful look. Mr. Rogers was about to knock on Jennifer's door to see if she was all right, but he stopped because he heard her crying inside, and that hateful look turned dreadful. Mr. Rogers knocks on Jennifer's door, but she doesn't answer. He thought she was too terrified to answer. Mr. Rogers took off his backpack, opened it to put out a clown horn, and squeezed it twice. That's his way of letting Jennifer know it's him. Mr. Rogers stood in front of the door till Jennifer slowly opened. When Mr. Rogers saw Jennifer's face covered in tears, he grabs her and gives her a hug. Then with a kind motion, Mr. Rogers took Jennifer by the hand, leading her out of her apartment, closing the door behind them, and headed to his apartment. He watches on as Jennifer sleeps. He heads back to the couch and wonders what he can do. He heard a noise coming from the bedroom where Jennifer slept. She walks towards the room but doesn't enter. He just looks in and sees a frightened woman. Mr. Rogers watches Jennifer as she cries in her sleep. Right then and there, Mr. Rogers made up his mind. Standing in the darkness of his apartment, a red smile painted itself across his face. Next day, as he said, Jennifer's boyfriend returned the next day, pounding on the door trying to get Jennifer's attention. Jennifer wasn't in her apartment. She was in Mr. Rogers, sleeping peacefully, but Mr. Rogers was standing inside Jennifer's apartment staring at the door. Every time he hits the door, something inside Mr. Rogers was trying to break out. Every word he speaks feeds what's growing inside, and every insult strips away Mr. Rogers' humanity. After 5 minutes, Jennifer's boyfriend beating the shit out of her door stopped. Mr. Rogers slowly and quietly walked towards the door, placing his hands on the door, looking through the peephole. Seeing Jennifer's boyfriend taking a shot of liquid courage. With one last fuck you and kick to the door, Jennifer's boyfriend walks away and heads towards the elevator. Mr. Rogers places his head against the door with anger and rage flowing through his blood. Something inside breaks free. Mr. Rogers walked towards the window stairs outside until Jennifer's boyfriend exited the building, watching him walk away. Mr. Rogers stares at Jennifer's boyfriend as he walks away further. Mr. Rogers places his right hand on the glass and smiles. Jennifer's boyfriend was walking home till he received a text to meet at the old abandoned funhouse. The place was an abandoned carnival, and smack down in the center, what is the abandoned funhouse? He received another text telling him to go inside the funhouse and find me. He walks inside using his phone as the only source of light. Jennifer's boyfriend follows the path through the funhouse till he hits the Hall of Mirrors. There he sees a figure standing in the middle of the Hall of Mirrors with a source of light coming from a phone. He received another text from Jennifer, come find me. After receiving that text, Jennifer's boyfriend wandered around the Hall of Mirrors trying to find the right path to the center. After running from one dead end to another dead end, he finally reached the center of the maze. But Jennifer was nowhere to be found. The phone in his hand, what's going off, he was receiving another text. He raised phone to unlock it. It was from Jennifer. The look on his face went cold. The text said, "You found me." He screamed at the top of his lungs, screaming, "Don't fuck with me, bitch. When I find you, you're fucking dead. Show yourself, you fucking bitch." Right before he was going to say something else, he heard a noise in the distance. Freaking out, he turned to where the direction of the sound came from, dropping his phone. Losing the only source of light he had till he received another text message. He bends down to pick up his phone and stares at the screen. It was another text from Jennifer. With fear setting in, he stares at the screen and swipes his finger to unlock it. The fear he felt turned terrifying black. Jennifer's text read, "You found me. I'm standing right behind you." He hits the reply button and sends a message of his own saying, "Where are you again?" As he hits the reply button, he hears a bing coming from behind him. He slowly turns around hoping to see Jennifer, but all he saw was the light of the phone that someone was holding. He screams, "Who are you?" to the dark figure standing in the shadows. The man in the shadows slowly walked out, only showing most of his body, not showing his right arm. He screams, It's you. You're that fucking clown that lives next door. You're the one fucking with me." As some as Jennifer's boyfriend said that Mr. Rogers just smile. That pissed off Jennifer's boyfriend and he ran at Mr. Rogers with speed and strength. Mr. Rogers hits him in the chest. Jennifer's boyfriend hit the ground hard, and as he was about to get up, he noticed something shiny aimed at his face. His vision came into focus, and he saw that Mr. Rogers had an axe aimed at his face. As he was about to speak with speed and strength from Mr. Rogers, he smacked Jennifer's boyfriend across the jaw with the back of the axe. Breaking his jaw, he let out a wicked scream, coughing and spitting out blood. Mr. Rogers looks on as he tries to crawl away. Mr. Rogers grips the handle of the axe with both hands, and with speed and strength slams it on his back with the back of the axe. Forcing him to kiss the ground, Mr. Rogers walks over and bends down, grabbing his hair with his hand, lifting his head. Mr. Rogers leans in and whispers into his ear with a dark, disturbing voice, "Did you enjoy the show?" His eyes widen because of all the crap, all the abuse, all the bullshit, and all the pain he did to Jennifer. At the end of all, he always said, "Did you enjoy the show?" Mr. Rogers slams his head to the ground. Mr. Rogers gets up, it looks down, he just stares at Jennifer's boyfriend. Then Mr. Rogers stares at the axe in his hand, then looks back at Jennifer's boyfriend. Their eyes met without saying anything. Mr. Rogers said to him, "Choose a god that you think will be fair." Is the Rogers group the axe handle with both hands, raises it above his head with no words, just with one motion. Justin Rogers said goodbye by slamming the axe on the ground with Jennifer's boyfriend lies. Later that night, Jennifer was coming home from celebrating her birthday, and as she got off the elevator, she saw a package in front of her door. It was wrapped like a present. She got close, there was a card on top of the package. Jennifer picked up the card and it only said 3 words, "Happy birthday, Jennifer." Jennifer picked up the package, took out her keys to open her door. As Jennifer entered her apartment, she put the package down on the coffee table, then headed to the kitchen to grab a knife. She sat down on the couch and just stared at the package, wondering who sent it and why. Jennifer picks up the knife and starts cutting the package open to see what's inside. After she was done with a knife cutting off the tape, she opens the box and looks in. With a frightening, jumping scare, Jennifer closes the box and pushes it off the coffee table. With a terrifying fear of what she just saw, she takes her keys and heads out the door and runs down to Mr. Rogers' apartment. Jennifer knocks and bangs on Mr. Rogers' door until he opens. Mr. Rogers opens the door and Jennifer wraps her arms around him as she was shaking in fear. Mr. Rogers grabs Jennifer by the shoulders and looks into her eyes, knowing that she was scared. Mr. Rogers decided to let Jennifer into his apartment. Jennifer felt safe when Mr. Rogers was around. Mr. Rogers stayed with Jennifer till she fell asleep. Mr. Rogers took her keys and headed out the door, walking down the hall to Jennifer's apartment. Unlocking the door and looking down seemed the package that Jennifer pushed off the coffee table that he left behind. He picked up the package and placed it back on the coffee table. He opened the box and a red smile painted across his face because inside the box was Jennifer's ex-boyfriend's head. Story 3. A blood spear and a bleaker sun. Nothing in the story I'm about to tell is going to be supernatural or unexplained. There is no great mystery to glean out of my telling. There won't be any surprises or revelations made here. I am merely making my way through the fog of amnesia. I am, literally speaking, retracing the steps I had lost many years ago. I am writing this to the cold auditory landscape of Monty's In the Depths of Darkness album. If any of this comes out as more depressive or colder than it should, I apologize in advance. For me, this process is a way to get rid of the intrusive thoughts that keep up at night. Strange mental pictures sneaking up on me in the quiet hours of the day from within the boundless darkness of the night. Bizarre images of the dead and the dying circling me in their uninterrupted eternal rest. This specific battle with unreasonable fears and anxiety started after a funeral. One of many such battles with an incurable enemy. But I'll get to that later. My longtime friend George. He passed away from cancer recently. It ate at him like a starved animal. He was gone almost in an instant. Between the time he told me about his diagnosis and his passing, 5 months had passed. In that time frame, life had bled from out of his body. 5 months is what it took for the malignancy to reduce him from a giant of a man to a mummified husk, barely able to keep his massive skeletal frame upright. George could have been a strong man if he wanted to. He certainly had the size for it. He was a gentle giant, though. The last time we spoke, he asked me if I remember the films we used to make together as kids. I remembered something about it. Didn't remember the details at all, however. He told me all about it, bringing back a flood of pleasant memories. When I was a kid, I wanted to get into cinematography. A bunch of friends of mine and I did. We all aspired to be a filmmaking crew together, so during our days in middle school in the early aughts, we made a bunch of short films and sketches. None of it panned out, as I'm sure is clear by now. George reminded me of the compact discs I was supposed to have with all these projects of ours. He said he watched a bunch of them recently and that it was a shame we never got to make anything professionally. I scoffed at the idea when we spoke, thinking we must have been incredibly amateurish about our craft. Only after his passing did I find the will and the CDs to revisit this old passion of mine, one I had forgotten I even had. Upon a second viewing of the material, I can proudly say that we were too good for a bunch of teens doing amateur short films. There were a bunch of sketches and movies there, ranging from slapstick comedy with toilet humor to action-style flicks riddled with parkour sequences. There's also a hype video someone made of my swimming. I used to be a competitive swimmer in my youth, that is, until an injury forced me out of the sport. Then there was this one film whose title had an aura to it, The Rasp. For a reason I couldn't understand back then, I couldn't get myself to play the video for what seemed like an hour. Something about that thing felt off. Granted, there was nothing off about the film. It took me a moment, but I finally played the file. It took about 15 seconds of the dry, labored breathing we used as the score at the beginning of the video to take me decades back. Pausing the video, I took a moment to soak in my returning memories. The Rasp was supposed to be our big break. That's what we saw it as, our so-called big break. The memories came back flooding. This was the first time we treated it like real cinematography. There were a bunch of kids from school in the neighborhood I didn't even know involved in this thing. We had them as extras in the film. We made the whole thing with utmost realism in mind. It seemed as real as we could afford to make it on a non-budget. A 12-minute motion picture exploring the unmatched beauty of human mortality in all of its oppressive glory. I was playing the role of a dead person, along with dozens of other kids. We were all covered in grayish body paint to make ourselves look as close to real corpses as possible. I started remembering how we covered the walls of the building we filmed in with drawings made by the elder sister of one of my friends, Catherine Montserrat. She was one of the few cool adults around. We're still in touch to this day. I remember she used to mix her dye with her blood. I know she's making a living as an artist and an art teacher, but I'm not sure if she's still doing the blood thing. When her brother Mark convinced her to work on the creepy art for our project, she ended up showing me her process. You'd never believe someone who is the epitome of sanity would just cut open their hand and then shove a paintbrush into the wound. But that's how she did it. She's the one who introduced all of us into cool adult music too. She kept saying that nu metal and grunge, which were the mainstream heavy music back then, were boring and for losers. These were simpler times. Anyway, once the euphoria of finding something I couldn't find for so long finally subsided, I pressed play and let my eyes get lost in the gloomy atmosphere of George's camera, slowly exploring a poorly lit concrete structure. The erratic breathing in the background seemed to crawl out of my speakers and into my room, almost engulfing me. He panned the camera onto a series of purposefully poorly drawn images hanging on the wall, some hanging loosely on the wall. As he passed drawing after drawing, a clear picture emerged. It was a tale of great sorrow and pain boiling into pure hatred. It was a story of a strange man and his little dog, much like the artist who drew that man's life. The man was a painter. He kept painting his little four-legged friend over and over. He seemed happy in the first drawing shown. Deeper into the corridor, there was a drawing hanging of the two walking down the street, the backdrop of the story growing increasingly dark. As George went deeper into the corridor, the drawings turned darker. A group of hooded figures showed up from the darkness, first mocking the man and his dog, then pulling out bats and knives to attack the man. It was horrible. The awful breathing noise, the grimy drawing style. The camera slightly shook as George attempted the emotional weight of the story unfolding before my eyes. A couple of feet deeper and the man is being beaten up. The next drawing has the little animal attempting to defend its owner. In the next, it's struck down. Further, they're both on the floor, beaten and bloodied. The dog ends up gravely injured. It doesn't make it. The following drawing is of the man weeping over his dog, followed by one where he is about to bury his deceased companion. My heart was in shambles watching this. The breathing in the background slowly turned into heaving pounding in my ears as the drawing shifted from a depiction of a physical tragedy to the mental anguish of a man who had lost his everything. If pain and anguish were monsters, Katie's amorphous, shadowy, demonic design crawling out of a defeated man's shape would probably be an accurate depiction. When George passed the final drawing on the wall, I could feel the cold air of the recorded space tightening its grip on me. It was a grotesque, misshapen apparition of a man metamorphosed into an abyssal monstrosity. The camera made a sharp turn to face a door with a peeling paint job. It was an old, ancient even. No one was in that building for years before we got there, I reckon. The heaving in the background has morphed into a throaty clicking noise that won't stop trying to crack my skull open. George's hand pushed the door open. It creaked through the clicking noises, grating against my eardrums, and an imagined scent of dust assaulted my nostrils. I am completely immersed in the film. The silhouettes of people lying in neatly arrayed beds were visible from the edge of the room where George was filming. A single light bulb, barely working, hung overhead, swinging softly. It was hardly illuminating anything in that room, producing just enough light to make out the details clearly, while adding to the sinister feeling of the film. With slow and deliberate steps, he entered the room. My heart began racing as my mind was expecting some kind of catch. A jump scare, a loud shriek bouncing against the walls. Something. Logic and experience told me something had to happen, but my memory wasn't complete yet to tell me what was supposed to happen. George approached the first bed, capturing a human silhouette covered with sheets. Cautiously placing his hand on the sheet, he slowly pulled it down, and I turned anxious watching him do that. I was expecting something. Bloody rats, a roar, a real monster lurking beneath the sheet, a head rolling onto the floor to scare the life out of the camera-carrying boy. Instead, all I got is another kid, pale and motionless, his eyes closed, imitating death. The revelation didn't put me at ease. Instead, my anxiety kept getting worse with each passing second I was viewing the film. George continued walking around the room, approaching every bed, removing each sheet, and allowing me to stare at the faux corpse beneath, some of whom are familiar, while others are strangers. And as that process unfolded, I kept thinking something's got to happen. Something had to happen. Something would happen. Someone would bite him with force. Someone wouldn't wake up after the camera stops rolling. There would be a real dead body under one sheet. A knife-swinging man was going to emerge from the darkness. Nothing. Nothing happened. It was a mock corpse after a mock corpse after a mock corpse. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. My appearance in the film didn't make me feel any better. It made my dread worse. By the time George had reached the bed I was lying in, I completely forgot I was one of those corpses too. When he finally pulled the sheet from my past self's head, we both screamed at what awaited beneath. Me and Film George. A dead, empty stare. My dead, empty stare. I wore contact lenses to make it seem as if the fog of the moribund had completely veiled my open eyes. A perverted version of my past yet simultaneously future self stared at me from the screen. There was something disturbingly uncanny in the corpse me, and while the movie continued with George continuing his documentation of the mock corpses, I couldn't keep watching the film. The visual of my mortality remained burned into my retinas, and for a few heart-wrenching moments I saw it everywhere I turned my gaze. A sudden feeling that I can only describe as a fire alarm without sound going off in my head forced me to pause the video. The floodgates of my subconsciousness broke down, allowing lost memories to resurface. Perhaps it wasn't the loss of memory as much as it was the suppression of unpleasant memories. Staring at a poorly lit silhouette on a bed on my screen, I remember how a week after we finished working on this thing, Seth, an older friend of ours who already had a driver's license, was driving us home after classes. Chris, George, and I. Someone flew from the opposite direction into our lane, slamming headfirst into ooze. I found all of this in hindsight. My head and neck got messed up, the impact scrambled my brain, and I had lost recollection of a long time frame. George ended up hospitalized too. He had a bunch of broken ribs and a ruptured lung, and Chris never made it. Seth was virtually unharmed, barring a few scratches and bruises from the windshield shattering on top of him. I sat there staring at the screen. Film George was about to approach Chris. My insides twisted in knots and my head turned unbearably heavy. I felt sick with my vision shifting between the frozen picture on the screen and the memory of that day. The screeching of wheels and a brief flash of burning pain coursing along my body before everything vanished. I felt ill, as if my body had developed a fever. Shaking, I turned the video off. There's no way I'm going to watch that thing ever again. I don't know what else I had forgotten, but I don't even want to know at this point. I was so shaken by the sudden recollection that I ended up getting sick. It's been a while since I've watched The Rasp, but the images from the film are still lingering in my mind. I haven't slept right since because of a relapsing insomnia. The visual of this morgue containing my childhood friends and acquaintances is trapping me inside my mind. It's as if something inside of me wants to see the film's ending. My mental innards cling to the hope that there's some catharsis at the end of it all, but there is none. I know how it ends. There is nothing there. Only different shades of death. A painful memory of an inevitable future. I ended up talking to Katie about the film. She said she remembers working on it fondly. She still has the original painting somewhere in her collection. Out of morbid curiosity, I asked her how the film ends. She said that George uncovers all the bodies in the building and leaves the same way he came. However, instead of panning his camera on the right wall of the corridor, he pans it on the left one, revealing a continuation of her story. In these drawings, the man has finally lost his sanity to hatred. He plans on killing those who killed his dog, but always ends up finding them dead, murdered brutally. This continues, along with his spiral further into madness. Katie depicted his loss of humanity with purposefully inhumanly shaped screams and grimaces. The story reaches its climax when he finally reaches the last person he set out to kill, but he ends up finding out what had killed them all. A vile dog monster that mauls its last victim in front of its eyes. The beast reveals itself to be the man's old dog, turned into a vengeful spirit.
There's a rather heartwarming drawing of the beast wagging its tail at the sight of its previous owner. This is where Katie's grim brilliance shines brightest. With the last 5 drawings, she snatches all hope away from the observer. The man doesn't recognize the beast as his old friend and ends up running away in fear.
In the penultimate drawing shown in the film, the man is dying in a pool of his blood, after being run over in incoming traffic. The beast looks on dejected at its dying master as its form slowly disintegrates in the last picture of the film and the screen turns black. Katie sent me scans of the drawings, and hell, it looks far worse than it sounds. Features lose cohesion as the story progresses. Katie probably used a lot of blood to draw the final few scenes of that story. She made the last few drawings entirely rusty red. I started feeling better again. Until today, when I received the news that Seth ended his life. He had never been the same after the accident. He became depressed and withdrawn. Even though it wasn't his fault, he still blamed himself for Chris's death and George's and mine's injuries. We drifted apart after the fact, but I never blamed him for any of this. Neither did George. As far as I know, the Moores, Chris's family, never blamed him either. As I was reading the text message about Seth's death, the demons in my head twisted Katie's voice into a low, hoarse drawl, echoing against the wall of my skull. Seth Novak, remember him? He played the final dead guy in The Rasp. I gave him a nasty makeup contusion around the neck for his part in the film. Boomed in the back of my mind. Jesus Christ. Seth hanged himself.